Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is befriending the ego. We often talk about how we want to annihilate the ego and we resist aspects of the ego and fight with the ego. And today we get to explore what might be possible if we befriend the ego, recognizing that it is the vehicle through which we experience life. So it should be entertaining. But before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, all your electrons, all your molecules, and creating this brilliant beam of light from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together. Very softly rub your fingers against your palms and feel the deliciousness of that sensation. Allow yourselves to become present to this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome on this Friday. Good morning, Roslyn. Good morning to everybody else who's joining us. Thank you all so much for being here. And so we're talking today about befriending the ego, because we've been talking a lot about resistance and releasing resistance to life in order to bring us to presence. And one of the big areas of resistance that I'm alert to is how we resist the ego, or we become completely immersed in the ego. And I think that's where the ego gets a bad rap, is when we just run wild with it rather than having some perspective on it, having an awareness of ourselves and using the ego and that awareness of the ego as a foil for our own growth and development. And so one of the things that I see very commonly in my clients, in people, is that we tend to judge ourselves. You know, we have a reaction to something or we have a behavior, and then we judge ourselves for that behavior. And it's this downward spiral, right? And rather than like that is an egoic reaction, okay? But rather than going down that deep, dark spiral of judgment layered upon judgment, we have the option instead to look at those circumstances that previously we were judging with curiosity instead. So curiosity is the antidote to judgment. When we stand back without, in curiosity to observe something, then there's an inroad. Good morning, Kimberly. Welcome. It's great to have you here. We're talking about befriending the ego, rather than fighting it, using it as a foil from which we can learn and expand and grow. And then it begs the question, you know, what is it that's learning and expanding and growing? I did my nerd thing and I looked up the definition of ego, and it doesn't fit with a lot of the ways that we interact with the notion of ego. We normally think, and this is one of the definitions too, is conceit and self-importance. You know, we talk about that as being the ego, but in philosophy, the ego is defined as the enduring and conscious element that knows experience. And it's also known as the complete person comprising both body and soul. So the ego is the vehicle through which we do experience life. And, we were in the beginning centering every day. We talk about bringing yourselves present to this remarkable physical form that's the vehicle through which we experience life. And what is animating that vehicle, ultimately what's animating that vehicle is source energy. But the way that it's expressed for us in our lives is our ego. And I don't mean the ego that's all puffed up. I mean the ego that is unified, the ego that is our means of interpretation through the world. And we have this capacity for self-reflection. And with that capacity for self-reflection, when we recognize the ego, or the patterns of the ego, then we can have inroads into transforming it. So the idea here is to, like one of the tools to be able to penetrate the predispositions or the patterns of the unaware ego. I'm going to make that distinction here, is to cultivate curiosity. So when we cultivate curiosity, then we have access or greater access to understand the dynamics behind certain behaviors or reactions. When we have judgment, then judgment is kind of closing a door. Judgment is having a fixed interpretation of something as like a finalized view of something. So it presumes that we know what something is in a certain way, and then we can judge it because we've characterized it, and then we get to judge it. And Rosalind says, isn't ego our means with which we express ourselves? Yes, it is. Or is the ego an identity that tells us stories to keep us safe? Yes, it is. All of the above, I think, that all of our experience is couched within this container or resides within this container that we call ego, right? And yes, we know that the ego can run away with itself, when we fall into self-righteousness, when we succumb to judgment, when we become very self-important. We operate from the presumption of self-importance, actually, but we experience it on all different degrees. But really, we experience the world as a reflection or a projection of ourselves, just by nature of the way we're built. That's we have this vehicle through which we experience life. And so if we talk about the annihilation of the ego, it sounds really, really violent, right? But if we allow the ego kind of to fall away, that's a whole different experience, right? What we're looking for in presence is to be flow, is to be the expression of life, rather than the projection of all our ideas, our beliefs, our patterns, right? And when we are able to transcend those things, that is the transcendence of the ego. And meantime, the ego is what we're here with to be able to experience life, right? Like let's say we're we're players in a play, or in a movie. We each have our roles that we're fulfilling, and we all have these dramas that we get to enjoy and struggle and suffer through and be exhilarated by. It's the 10-ticket ride that we're here for, right? And without the ego, we don't get that ride. So if we can have that perspective of life being this brief moment, life is but a flickering candle. We have a moment on the stage and then that's it. Well, we manifest here. We have all these experiences. We have this form in order to have our experiences. And the ego is the vehicle for that experience, right? And when we talk about raising consciousness, I think what we're doing is we're shifting our relationship to the ego, rather than being immersed in and unconsciously an expression of the ego. We have the capacity within the ego to reflect upon ourselves. So we can be self-reflective. That's also ego, by the way, right? Because every expression of us as individuated consciousness is really ego. No, I mean, say so if you believe differently, but I mean, that's my perception. So Rosalind says, perhaps ego judgment comes from lack, fear, or loss. Yes, and yes. I think that's a really good observation. Judgment comes from trying to protect ourselves, or trying to understand, which is also trying to control. Judgment can come from lack and loss, as well as fear. Rosalind goes on to say, while intuitive questions are from the perspective of love, what's the most loving path or choice that will lead us to true self? I love it, Rosalind. Thank you for that. Beautifully said. And when we talk about choice, underlying choice is some form of assessment and evaluation, which is another form of judgment, right? Making judgments, making determinations, where that's fundamental to our beingness as humans, right? We are constantly making choices. And I just had a flash of a video game, where you get to go this way or that way. There's a great story called The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges. I probably am destroying the pronunciation of his name, but it's a wonderful, wonderful story talking about how these different choices resolve in different ways, and that maybe they all coexist in the same time and space, and maybe alternate dimensions. In any case, we make choices. So when we make choices, what are we basing our choices on? Right? We're making choices based on, well, is this going to be better for me? Is this going to be forwarding my intention? Is this, how do we make choices? We're making judgments all the time. So judgment in and of itself is a function of our humanity, right? And when we, and I guess this is in a way a thought experiment, because I can't say that I live there, but when we are living in the flow of life, it's almost like life chooses for us. Like the path unfolds as we step off the cliff, the next support appears, so that we're in this in this constant dance with life unfolding without making our determinations and judgments. And so that being the case, I find it really interesting to be looking at how we have really vilified the ego, given that it is the vehicle through which we experience life. So when we vilify the ego, it's our ego doing that, haha, right? It is the ego that's doing that. And so what's about that? I think when we recognize that the ego is the vehicle for our expression in life, we can release the resistance. And that's what this whole thing is about, coming back around full circle. We can release the resistance to our beingness to allow ourselves perhaps greater insight and inroads. Whatever we resist persists. So when we look at habits that we don't like, and then we judge the habits, what are we doing? We're embedding those habits even more deeply. One of the reasons this conversation came about today is because I have a couple clients, and it's really fascinating to see, who are really, really, really committed to their limitations and they, or certain patterns of behavior, okay, that they say, oh, it would be so wonderful if this pattern of behavior weren't there. And at the same time, they're clinging to those patterns of behavior with all the strength they have, because there's the belief, even though reality in big air quotes, even though reality is challenging the effectiveness or even the truth of their belief, they just keep going back to holding that belief over and over and over again, despite any kind of evidence that they can speak themselves. It's just that belief is entrenched so profoundly, and we get to chip away at it. We are chipping away at it, and we are shifting them. But oftentimes, what I notice is when people, even though they believe something very strongly, they don't hold it, they don't grasp it, they don't grasp onto it and cling to it as voraciously, as actively, and then they allow themselves to shift. But these folks, man, they are so devoted to these particular beliefs. It's wild. Knowing that those beliefs don't serve them, knowing that there's a false equation. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see when we do that. And I think a lot of us do that, actually, that there are certain fundamental beliefs that we hold on to, despite the fact that facts do not support those beliefs, or that our experience doesn't even support those beliefs. Not only does our experience not support those beliefs, but our experience directly defies those beliefs, and yet we continue to maintain them, and like they are the source of our life and strength. It's so fascinating. Anyway, I just, so that clinging, that's ego, right? Probably those, that it's the lesser expression, not the higher expression of ego trying to protect and defend itself, perhaps. So Rosalind says, ego's voice about the tribe was strong for me. I was looking for my belonging or value. There was freedom in releasing attachment to knowing my true worth is inside and not found outside, less attachment to looking for others' approval. Rosalind, that is such a profound transformation. And this is the transformation that I believe will save humanity. is when we stop looking outside for our value and validation, when we stop looking for the externalities to legitimize ourselves. That's when the world can shift, because we have been conditioned to abandon our own wisdom in deference to externals, our own value, our own intrinsic worth. And we have been conditioned to be calibrating our value and our worth based on externalities. Good morning, Gia. So glad to have you here with us. We're talking about befriending the ego and creating a different relationship with the ego that enables us to have transformative experience, to use the ego as a vehicle of transformation, which it is. Any transformation is occurring through the vehicle of the ego anyway. At least it's expressing through the vehicle of the ego. But by cultivating curiosity and releasing resistance, and cultivating awareness, the ego is our tool for movement into transformation or awareness. And part of that is releasing resistance. And so when we are clinging to our beliefs, when we are clinging to our identity, that's an ego function, but that's kind of the negative side of ego, right? That's the part that is keeping us mired, and rather than the part that enables us to transform and grow. Anyway, one of the things I was just talking about, how some people really truly cling to beliefs that they know aren't true, that they know that the equation that they have set up for themselves doesn't work. And so there's a saying that if you argue for your limitations, you get to keep them. And this is something that we very frequently engage in, is arguing for our limitations. And we do that by using excuses, by absolving ourselves or displacing responsibility. Like when we take responsibility for our lives, even for circumstances that doesn't look like that we had anything to do with creating them. But if we take responsibility, not blame, and this is a big deal too. Like years ago, before I understood all this stuff, people would say, you're responsible. You're responsible for your life. And I was like, why, if I'm responsible, why in the world would I create these circumstances in my life? Why would it made no sense to me. Why would I do this? It's making my life so miserable. If I could change it, I would change it. And it's different I received it in those times as blaming me for what was going on in my life. We're not talking about blame, and this is a really important nuance. What we're talking about is the movement, the internal movement from victimhood to empowerment. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't victimization that you experienced. I'm not discounting that, okay? I'm not in any way minimizing the victimization that may have occurred. And we've talked about this again and again. Experiencing being the victim is an entirely different ballgame. When we allow ourselves to own, to be responsible for, to take ownership of the experiences that we've had, there's an empowerment in it. And that is a way in which we can use the ego to transform, transcend, and beyond. So Elaine, good morning. Good morning. I didn't see your hello earlier. I apologize. I did not mean to skip over you by any stretch of the imagination. So welcome. It's great to have you here with us. And Gia says, I love the way you bring awareness around the ego, and also think ego is one of the reasons we are connected and we want to know who we actually are. Beauty of the ego is it feels painful, suffering, all sorts of things. And I'm adding, it also experiences joy and delight and happiness. And then Gia continues, till we understand the reason behind them, those negative emotions emotions we call negative, and use them for our benefit. 100%. So the ego is the vehicle through which we experience life. You know, just like our physical form is a vehicle through which we experience life, and we can evolve the ego. And then the last stage of evolution is the transcendence of the ego, right? So Elaine says, if the ego is wounded, it's a call for self-love. Be gentle and kind as you would with a child. Exactly. We get to heal and expand and develop these aspects of ourselves. And when we vilify the ego, when we exile or try to exile the ego or fight the ego, what we're doing is we are embedding the very things that we're trying to transcend or transform. So when we can cultivate curiosity to know, and awareness plus curiosity, then we have the ability to be moving into another dimension of awareness and experience. So Elaine says, all good. I have no attachment to being seen or heard, love. I believe you 100%, Elaine. And thank you for that. And anyway, we're talking about befriending the ego and interacting with ourselves from a place of generous curiosity rather than judgment. And that attitude of curiosity and generosity is what can enable healing of the ego, as well as a higher expression of it, and a more positive engagement into other levels of experience. Rosalind, thank you so much for posting. I'm posting it. I'm wondering if it is you, Rosalind, posting links to the YouTube shows. Thank you for that. Or I'm wondering if there's a confusion somehow with Enlightened World Network. That's so interesting. Anyway, whoever posted it, if it was you, Rosalind, thank you so much. And thank you, Dido. I don't, how wild. Anyway, that's it for this morning. It's Friday, so how about going into the weekend with this generous openness toward yourself and your own expression? Oh, okay, it's Dido. So that, oh, how funny. Okay, well, thank you, Dido. I'm so glad you were here this morning. So I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page at 9 a.m. Eastern. And so I invite you to join us every weekday, and also to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living and EWN One with the Earth. And I wish you a wonderful, wonderful weekend. It is such a privilege for me to be able to. Hi, Tammy. So glad you could join us. It's such a privilege to be spending this time with you and to be engaged in these conversations. You make the conversation. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, so much love.